Welcome to this week's edition of Journalist Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests this week are Harrison Cann, senior reporter for City and State PA, Marc Levy, State House and politics reporter for the Associated Press, and Julia Terruso, politics and governing reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Julia, we'll start with you. You attended President Trump's speech before Congress earlier this week. What were your big takeaways?
Yeah, it was my first time attending in person, so it was quite the energy in the room was definitely palpable, both on the Republican side and then the kind of stone-faced Democratic opposition. This was the longest speech to a joint session of Congress, I think, in modern presidential history. He started off touting the swift and unrelenting, I think he said, nature of the last 45 days or so that he's been in office, and went on to outline, many of his administration's priorities. I think the main takeaway for me was kind of what I heard afterwards. I ran into Senator McCormick in the hallway, and he said he thought it was a great speech that outlined in great detail what the administration had done, and then heard from a number of Democrats who had, perhaps unsurprisingly, the opposite reaction. I think Congressman Brendan Boyle said it was the angriest, most divisive speech he'd ever heard from an American president. So kind of in line with the tensions we've been seeing in Washington over the last month and a half or so.
I'd like to broaden this out to everyone. How are the president's early policies affecting Pennsylvanians?
Well, I guess I'll take that as, we have, there's a couple friction points. One is federal funding not getting to Pennsylvania in the timeliness with which the state might expect. So we saw the governor go to court to try to free up money, and he has since said that the roughly $2 billion plus that the lawsuit listed has been freed up. That was a lot of money from a couple of the signature Biden laws, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that dealt with a lot of clean energy money, pollution reduction money. But, there is still a federal lawsuit going on with other states as plaintiffs talking about other monies being held up, for instance, transportation money. The other thing that we're seeing is we are seeing nursing homes and hospitals in Pennsylvania starting to weigh in on the prospect of Medicaid cuts. So the legislation is in its early stages in the U.S. House. It is legislation that the president has sought to try to cut spending, but if you're going to cut spending significantly through the federal government, inevitably you're going to be hitting something like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. And so this bill, it sort of raises the specter of cuts to Medicaid. And we are, like I said, we're seeing hospitals and nursing homes raising an alarm because they feel that they're already squeezed significantly, and that going back to a prior time when there was less Medicaid money for them would be devastating to their bottom line.
Harrison, I'd like to turn to you now. What kind of impact do you see on President Trump's early first days in office?
As he walked in a divided area, and it's still largely divided based on party line. One of the things that I saw most recently were the NPR PBS Marist poll that came out that showed the Doge and Trump approval rating at around 34%. So not necessarily the highest approval, and that's among independent voters. And even 2/3 of those said that the movement at the federal level is just it's too fast, and it's happening in a way that's not considering broader impacts. So even at the local level, there's people that seem to be questioning some of the swift and unrelenting moves.
Julia,
and I think to Harrison's point, I was just going to say, there's also a lot of confusion in terms of exactly what Doge is targeting. We had some reporting this week about the SEC building in Philadelphia being on a list of leases that's being terminated. But, what that means for the roughly 150 people who work there, we're not sure. Is the office maybe just moving elsewhere? We don't know. And it's not just reporters who don't know. The members of Congress who I talked to also say it's kind of hard to get answers out of the agency as they're making these cuts.
And to Julia's point, there is a lot of confusion. The General Services Administration posted a list of several hundred buildings that it essentially suggested it would be selling, right? Federal buildings that it would be emptying out and selling. And then that list was scaled back, and then within hours it disappeared. And the General Services Administration hasn't really explained what's going on with that, but it does raise the specter, or raise the suggestion that major federal buildings, landmark federal buildings in big cities around the country are going to be liquidated. But we don't know, because the General Services Administration posted this list, then it took the list down, it hasn't reappeared. It's hard to tell what's going to happen, and that's also in the sea of hundreds of other federal offices, smaller federal offices that are leased around the country, where the prospect is that these leases will be ended, and these smaller federal offices with workers in them will be forced to migrate somewhere else or leave their jobs.
If we could refer back for a moment to the president's speech, U.S. Senator John Fetterman posted a tweet last night that said he described the Democratic response as, quote, unhinged petulance, end quote, and he said, quote, it only makes Trump look more presidential and restrained, end quote. What do you make of this? What do you make of this reaction?
Well, I think it echoes much of what we've heard from Senator Fetterman since President Trump was elected, which is this suggestion that Democrats shouldn't panic about everything, that they shouldn't, raise their fists in the air. And what we saw during the president's speech was kind of varied responses. They had some placards they held up that said save Medicaid or false. Of course, Congressman Al Green stood up with a cane and challenged the president directly and was thrown out of the chamber. Some of the women wore pink, but in the days since, it hasn't just been Senator Fetterman. Some other Democrats in the party have said that they thought, the showing wasn't united, that the lack of standing for special guests who, represented kind of bipartisan things you would normally stand for, survivors of cancer or, other people, was a bad look for the Democratic Party. So I think it's both something we're hearing from Democrats, but also very in line with Fetterman's kind of more middle of the road hesitancy to challenge President Trump directly the way some members of his party have.
Marc, you had noted in a recent article that some congressional Republicans that had narrowly won their seats are taking criticism for their early votes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, there are districts around the country that were narrowly won by Republicans. They have a very narrow majority in the House. There will be political targets on them in the 2026 election, and several of those very narrow wins are in Pennsylvania. That's Scott Perry in South Central, Rob Bresnahan, and I'm forgetting his first name, Ryan McKenzie, thank you, up in northeastern Pennsylvania. McKenzie and Bresnahan are freshmen, right? And so they don't have high name ID, and these were very narrow wins. And so what we are seeing now is, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing nursing home operators who are very worried about Medicaid cuts. Bresnahan came out before the House vote and said he would not vote to gut the benefits that his neighbors in his district rely on, and then he went and voted for a House bill that doesn't specifically call for cuts to Medicaid, but it does refer some like $900 billion over 10 years to a committee that deals with Medicaid to come up with cuts. So, the writing is on the wall if House Republicans follow through on this. It's in the early days, but Rob Bresnahan is getting heat over that. There's editorials in the Times Tribune over layoffs at the national park there, Steamtown National Historic Park. There was a protest there. We are seeing these tendrils going out to swing districts where people are angry, and you can blame this on people who voted against him anyway. But the bottom line is that, when hospitals and nursing homes and their executives and their workers begin to get concerned, that is quite possibly where the rubber meets the road.
Are there any Republicans giving pushback to the Trump administration?
I did want to bounce off actually Mark's point real quick. When we're talking about party reactions, the Republicans largely gave standing ovations and cheered along with Trump's speech on Tuesday. But in contrast to those ovations, when he started talking about the tariffs and import taxes, there was actually a lot of Republicans that remained seated and didn't give him any sort of ovation. So, if anything, that just goes to show, the interesting dichotomy at the local level between some of Republicans and what the White House administration is planning.
Do you foresee?
Yeah, and one other topic I would just raise is Ukraine. I think Congressman Fitzpatrick was actually on CNN this morning. He's been very careful about how he has talked about Ukraine, but he's always been a big advocate for supporting the country. And so, for a week or so now, he's been kind of putting out statements emphasizing how important he thinks that support is, talking behind the scenes with President Zelensky's chief of staff, but not directly naming President Trump or calling him out.
Do any of you foresee the actions of the Trump administration impacting elections in Pennsylvania, in particular the appellate judicial seats this year, or perhaps even more so in 2026, the congressional races?
Well, to Mark's earlier point, we know that one of those two congressmen already has a Republican challenger, Brian McKenzie and Lehigh Valley. And I think depending on how the final budget vote goes and what really does happen with potential cuts to Medicaid, you're going to see that as a huge issue that Democrats hammer now and moving toward the 2026 congressionals.
Brian Fitzpatrick also stands out too. One name who's a Republican that's kind of walked the Trump line pretty well because he's been able to be reelected in a relatively purple district outside of Philly. And he kind of spoke out against Trump's initial comments regarding Ukraine and the stopping of aid, but without mentioning Trump by name. So that's another situation where he's kind of just towing the line.
Yeah, and I mean, just to kind of get ahead of the 2026 election, you mentioned the judicial elections. There are 3 Democratic state Supreme Court justices who are running for retention, and it's an unusual election setup whereby they don't have an opponent. They're just running for another 10-year term, and it's a yes or no on the ballot in November. And inevitably, this election will be seen to some extent as a referendum on, the politics coming out of Washington, D.C. Normally, people sail through these judges sail through their retention election. There are early signs that Republicans will try to mount a campaign against it. Those are very early signs. There's nothing definitive yet. But it will be interesting to see what happens in that election. Maybe an early indicator will be a state Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, which is on April 1st. There's a lot of money pouring into that. That may be a better indicator of how people are reacting to Washington, D.C. in a swing state.
Julie, you'd written about President Trump's halt on the refugee admissions program. What have the ramifications been of those actions?
Yeah, we looked into that a little. President Trump had channeled on the campaign trail that he was going to really cut down on the number of refugees coming into the country. So in some ways, while a dramatic shift from what we had before, this was expected. What I think agencies are struggling with that they didn't expect is that as part of this funding freeze, the money that goes to agencies who support refugees who are already here has also been frozen. So there were a lot of nonprofits in Lancaster and Philadelphia who have supported, refugees who've come over in the last couple months, getting them set up with housing or their kids enrolled in schools or career services and English language services. And a lot of those programs have stopped because they don't have the funding coming in anymore. They've had to do furloughs. And then, of course, for people who were hoping to bring family members over who are in some really dangerous situations in Afghanistan or Pakistan, it's really devastating for those families.
Harrison, you've been writing about the state budget quite a bit. With so much uncertainty going on at the federal level, how are state lawmakers anticipating the state budget coming together?
Oh, well, that's certainly a factor that it's going to be a big talking point during budget negotiations. There's hearings going on in Harrisburg right now with agencies trying to figure out what the needs are and where the investments should go. But I think the largest thing kind of looming over the budget is a possible structural deficit that the state's facing over the next several years. So a big talking point among Republicans and working with Democrats in the Shapiro administration is to try to rein in spending or at least expand the tax base, maybe a little bit of both. So that comes back to skill games, that comes back to the legalization of cannabis. And some of those could also be affected at the federal level too. So still a lot up in the air.
Yeah, just to pile on Harrison's point, your question to him, that Uri Monson, the governor's budget secretary, was asked this morning at a hearing about how is the machinations going on in Washington, D.C. possibly going to affect the budget and the federal money aspect of that. And he just said he had no idea and that he didn't have a crystal ball and he couldn't predict it. But you're right. It's going to be very unpredictable for the budget process in the next few months. Even when a budget does pass in Pennsylvania, assuming that it passes on time this summer, the federal fiscal year doesn't start until a couple months later. And that may be the time when, if indeed Republicans are intent on cutting spending, that begins to take effect. And so Pennsylvania could have a budget in force that makes assumptions that are no longer true a couple months later. But also what Harrison is saying is that, the deficit, the structural deficit that the state is facing, it has a massive increase in Medicaid spending this year that it has to account for. And how the Shapiro administration deals with that, whether they take it on, head on, or whether they try to hide it or put off bills or otherwise delay payments on it, that will be a major question in the next few months.
Harrison, if I can get you to talk a little bit more about some of the governor's specific initiatives, if you could talk a little bit about his lightning plan for energy and how that might impact Pennsylvania.
Yeah, his lightning plan is kind of in response to RGGI, the RGGI initiative that is kind of a cap and trade program that Governor Tom Wolf originally got the state involved in. Shapiro has said that the lightning plan is kind of a combination of the requests of the environmentalists that were on board with RGGI and as well as the business and the industry side that don't want the energy sector to have winners and losers chosen depending on the emissions. So there actually still is a lot of pushback. I know Republicans in the Senate, they don't want any form or alternative of a cap and trade program. So there's going to be another long-standing negotiation that's going to have to be resolved for that to pass.
Where does natural gas fit in with the governor's energy plan?
He wants to, I guess he refers to it as an energy plan, like an all the above energy plan. So he wants to have natural gas be an option, but not necessarily be as tapped into maybe as much as those in the industry or the Republicans might want to utilize.
Marc, you had written about this a little bit, in particular that there's, with an increased need for energy, there's more of a focus on going back to seeking natural gas-powered energy as opposed to some of the programs that would have reversed climate change. I guess, number one, this is a two-part question. Why the sudden increased demand for energy? And then secondly, why looking back at natural gas as opposed to some of these other alternatives?
Right, so this is a national phenomenon as well as in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is just lucky enough to be sitting on top of a huge natural gas reservoir. But essentially, this is inspired by artificial intelligence, the computing power needed to complete all these, online and computer requests to use artificial intelligence is incredibly energy intensive. And across the nation now you have tech companies snapping up real estate, building data centers, and trying to find power sources. And The most important aspect of that is electricity. They need electricity. It is driving up electricity demand for the first time in a couple decades. Electricity demand has been flat otherwise. There's other elements such as reshoring manufacturing. We saw the CHIPS Act under Joe Biden, where there were billions of dollars to build semiconductor plants or electric vehicle plants in the United States. That is also helping juice demand for electricity. And so, some of the system operators are not equipped to get solar projects or battery projects online fast enough. So natural gas is becoming the source of fuel that utilities and states are turning to. States are getting into the act of trying to get power plants built, and Josh Shapiro, the governor here, is no exception to that. His Lightning Plan essentially would incentivize the construction of new natural gas plants. And these are baseload plants that turn on and can run whenever they're needed. They can run all day. They can run half the day. This is the way that the nation is going right now to fill this demand in the next few years.
Harrison, if I can come back to you one more time. You had written about a delegation of House Democrats that had recently toured SEPTA, as SEPTA is seeking for greater funding assistance from the state. Can you talk a little bit about why their demand and their ask is increasing and the response that they've gotten from lawmakers?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a long-standing issue. SEPTA has also faced a fiscal cliff for a while. But a lot of the focus now is turning towards 2026 and all the special events that Philadelphia is hosting. In addition to the America 250 celebrations, there's the World Cup, several matches there, the MLB All-Star Game. So the SEPTA project managers really want to make sure that the city and its infrastructure is up to date, improved, and able to just handle that influx of visitors that's going to come over the next about 18 months or so. So initially, they're asking for about $21.5 million in investment. That's for operations, security, safety, so police presence as well, and marketing. So that's on top of the already financial situation, precarious financial situation that SEPTA's in.
Is it a tough ask for lawmakers seeking greater funding for mass transit agencies, particularly among lawmakers that are representing more rural areas?
Yeah, that seems to be one of the bigger sticking points is some lawmakers from around the state not necessarily wanting to invest that much in, just a Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Authority. But that being said, there have been some proposals that would increase, and in Shapiro's as well, increase the allotment for public transit statewide, not just for SEPTA. And there's a good chance that during the budget negotiations, the funding for SEPTA might get tied to the regulation of skill games, which that would be another form of tax revenue that could bolster transportation funding.
Harrison, what will you be working on in the next week?
Next week, I'm working on a little bit more public safety and police stuff, following up on the SEPTA story. I know there's a lot of talk right now, especially within the city, implementing a pilot program for bulletproof glass around the SEPTA bus drivers for their protection. So looking forward to more public safety oriented stuff.
Julia, what will you be working on?
I'm going to be working a little bit more on looking at some of the DOGE cuts and how they're going to impact Philadelphia and the region.
And Marc, same question to you.
Couple stories, more power plant electricity related stuff. There's also a story I'm working on about the GLP-1s, the weight loss drugs that Medicaid programs, some Medicaid programs cover, Pennsylvania's cover, and it's driving up costs for states that do cover it. And so states are trying to find ways to rein in the cost of those drugs.
I'd like to thank my guest this week, Harrison Cann, senior reporter for City and State PA, Marc Levy, State House and Politics reporter for the Associated Press, and Julia Terruso, politics and governing reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.